Picture this. Somewhere in northeastern Nigeria, January 2020. A video begins to circulate. In it, a man sits against a bare wall. His clothes are crumpled, his face tired, but his eyes carry something that does not belong to that room. He speaks slowly, carefully, in measured sentences. He says that he is trusting in God. He says that he hopes to return to his family. He says that if it does not happen, if the ending is different from the one he would choose, then it is the will of God, and he accepts it. He asks Christians everywhere not to be disturbed. He sends his love to his wife, his children, the churches he has served. He is a hostage. He has been in the hands of Boko Haram for 17 days. He does not look like a man who is dying. He looks like a man who has already made his peace with every possible outcome, and is now simply waiting to seize which one God has chosen. His name was Lawan Andimi. He was the chairman of the Christian Association of Nigeria in Michika local government area, a pastor who oversaw the spiritual life of 800 churches spread across one of the most dangerous corridors of land on earth. He was abducted on January 3, 2020, taken from the town of Michika in Adamawa State, while the rest of the world was still writing the New Year's date at the top of its letters. He was killed on January 20th, 2020. He was 60 years old. And the question that video raised, the question that people in Lagos and London and Vancouver kept asking each other after watching it, was not whether he was afraid. It was how a man reaches a place where fear no longer controls what he does. That answer does not begin in a hostage room in January 2020. It begins more than 5 decades earlier, in a small village in Adamawa State, in a boy who had no obvious reason to become anyone remarkable at all. Lawan Andimi was born in the early 1960s in the Michika area of northeastern Nigeria, in a region where the land is dry and the mountains rise abruptly from the plain, and where life has always required a particular kind of endurance. His family were farmers. His world was small in the way that most worlds are small at the beginning, bounded by the distances a child's legs can carry him, shaped by what his parents knew and what the community believed and what the soil would yield in a good year. The area sits near the edge of what would later become one of the most contested territories in the country. The mountains of the Mandara Range marked the border with Cameroon. The roads running north led eventually toward Lake Chad, toward territories that would, in another generation, become synonymous with terror and loss. None of that was visible yet. What was visible was ordinary life, the rhythms of planting and harvest, the noise of a village market, the weight of a childhood in a place where nothing is guaranteed and everything must be earned. He came to faith as a young man. The Church of the Brethren in Nigeria, known locally by its Hausa name, the Ecclesia Yanuwa Nigeria, had put down roots across Adamawa and the surrounding states. And it was through this community that Lawan Andimi encountered Christianity, not as a cultural inheritance, but as a personal claim. Something shifted. Something settled into place. He described it not with elaborate language, but with the directness of a man who has made a decision and does not feel the need to dress it up afterward. He believed, and he acted on what he believed. He married Gloria. Together they built a life, raised children, and stayed deliberately, repeatedly at cost, in a region that people with options were already beginning to leave. That staying would matter more than anything else about him. He became a pastor, then a leader of pastors, then in time the chairman of the Christian Association of Nigeria for Michika local government, a position that sounds administrative and is in practice anything but. In that role, Lawan Andimi was responsible for the pastoral and organizational life of 800 congregations stretched across communities where the roads were rough and the resources were thin, and the security situation had been deteriorating for years, in ways that the news outside Nigeria rarely captured with any precision. 800 churches in northeastern Nigeria, in the decade that Boko Haram declared its intention to eliminate Christian presence from the region entirely. That number deserves to be held carefully. It is not a statistic. It is 800 communities of people who gathered each week in buildings that had been burned before and would be burned again, led by pastors who had buried colleagues, in a part of the world where showing up for Sunday morning had become an act requiring the same kind of deliberate resolve that soldiers have to summon before walking into contested ground. Lawan Andimi served them. He drove the roads. He attended the funerals of pastors, of congregants, of whole families. He sat with widows. He organized responses. He kept speaking in council meetings and before hours and across tables where powerful men made decisions that affected ordinary people who had no other advocate in the room. He did this when most people in his position would have quietly moved their families south and let someone else carry the weight. He was not naive about what was happening. Boko Haram had been systematically dismantling Christian presence in the Northeast for years. Churches were bombed. Villages were raided in the early hours of the morning. People were taken, and sometimes came back broken, and sometimes did not come back at all. The violence was not random. It had a structure and a logic, and that logic pointed directly at men like Lawan Andimi. Visible, connected, the kind of leader whose removal would hollow out dozens of communities at once, who was harder to replace than a building. He stayed anyway. He was asked, more than once, whether he was concerned for his safety. He gave the kind of answer that does not satisfy a journalist but is entirely true. He was where God had placed him, and he had made his peace with what that meant. He was not performing fearlessness. He had simply, over many years and in many small choices, built something that made faithful presence the natural response when the harder moments arrived. The town of Michika had been attacked before Lawan Andimi's abduction. Boko Haram had swept through in 2014, burning what could be burned, taking what could be taken, and retreating back into the bush before the military arrived. The town was retaken. People came back. Churches were rebuilt. Lawan Andimi was part of that rebuilding, not just the structural kind, where you lay new blocks over scorched foundations, but the harder kind, where you sit across from someone who has lost a child or a husband, or the ordinary confidence that tomorrow will arrive as expected, and you find something true to say to them that is not simply noise. He found things to say. He kept finding them year after year in a place that kept producing reasons for grief. By the time January 2020 arrived, Michika had achieved a fragile stability. The military had a presence. Life had resumed its routines. Carefully, the way life always resumes after violence, with one eye kept toward the horizon and the reflexes of people who have learned that peace is not a permanent condition, but a season that requires watching. On the evening of January 3, 2020, Boko Haram came again. The exact details of how he was taken remain incomplete. What is known is that Lawan Andimi was abducted that evening, that he was taken into the same hills and bush that had swallowed others before him, and that his family and his 800 churches woke the next morning to the news that he was gone. Ransom negotiations began. They always begin. Gloria and his children waited. The churches prayed. The Christian Association of Nigeria appealed publicly. Government officials issued statements. 17 days passed in the particular anguish of not knowing. Each morning, arriving with the same absence it had arrived with the morning before. Somewhere in those 17 days, someone gave Lawan Andimi a phone. Whether this was intended as a psychological instrument, a way for the captors to demonstrate control by putting him on camera under pressure, or whether something more complicated was happening, is not clear. What is clear is that when Lawan Andimi spoke, he did not say what people who are held under duress typically say. He did not beg. He did not perform the distress his captors presumably wanted to see. He did not say the things that would project power onto them and helplessness onto himself. He sat against a wall in a room his family had never seen, and he spoke to the people who loved him with the same measured tone he had used in every pastoral visit and council meeting and Sunday sermon for 30 years. He said he was trusting in God. He said he hoped the negotiations would succeed, and that he would be released to be with Gloria, his children, the people of his churches. He said that if this did not happen, if God's will was something other than his survival, he received that too. He asked Christians watching not to be in dismay. He said, "I urge my brethren not to be disturbed. Everything will be all right." Then he said he loved them. The video spread. People who had never heard of Michika watched it in Lagos, in Nairobi, in Ottawa, in Melbourne. Many of them watched it more than once, leaning forward slightly, looking for the seam, the place where the calm fractured, where you could see through to the fear that had to be underneath. They did not find it. Not because he was not afraid. A man who had buried enough people in his region had no illusions about what his captors were capable of, but because fear was simply not the largest thing in the room with him. On January 20th, 2020, Lawan Andimi was killed by his captors. The confirmation came the way these announcements always come. A statement released, a wave of grief moving through the Northeast, and then outward through the Nigerian church, and then outward further still, through the community of people who had watched the video and held their breath. His body was returned to Michika. He was buried with the grief and the honor that his captors had tried to deny him. Gloria received him home. His children received him home. The 800 churches he had served received the news and kept meeting on Sunday. That is the thing Boko Haram could not account for. They took a man who had spent decades building something in the people around him, and what he had built did not leave with him. The district did not collapse. The churches did not close. Several of the younger pastors he had mentored stepped into the roles his death had left open and filled them with a similar quiet determination. One of his own children later entered ministry. The church in Michika, which had already survived fire and raid and years of accumulated grief, kept going. This is always what those who use violence to silence faith do not understand about men and women built the way Lawan Andimi was built. You cannot end what they have started by ending them. You only move the thing forward into everyone they have shaped. What built that calm? What produces a man who can sit in front of a camera 17 days into captivity and speak with the measured certainty of someone who has settled every question that matters long before the question was ever forced on him? It was not temperament. It was not the absence of imagination. Lawan Andimi knew exactly what happened to people in Boko Haram custody. He had buried some of them. He had sat with their families and prayed over their graves and continued functioning in the aftermath of their deaths. He had no illusions about the range of possibilities available to him. What he had instead was something built over decades, through choices that looked ordinary and local and small at the time, and only revealed their full weight in the moment that tested them. The first was the choice to stay. He had the education, the connections, and the leadership ability to have constructed a different life in a safer part of the country. He stayed in Michika not because he lacked alternatives, but because he understood something that people who leave tend eventually to recognize from a distance. Communities do not replace their leaders quickly. When a formed, committed leader leaves, the gap is real, and it persists, and the people remaining in it carry the cost of that absence in ways that are hard to fully quantify from outside. He chose repeatedly not to create that cost. Each time the region became more dangerous, and he stayed anyway, the decision became more embedded in who he was. It was no longer a choice he made each morning. It was the shape his life had grown into. The second was the choice to serve specifically rather than generally. Not to lead from a comfortable office, but to show up in the actual places where people were actually suffering. He drove the difficult roads. He sat across from the grieving. He attended one funeral after another in a season when funerals were constant. This is not a metaphor for something more important. It is itself the important thing. The man who remained steady in front of a Boko Haram camera in 2020 was the same man who had been practicing steadiness in the face of grief for 30 years. He had been putting in the repetitions, not performing presence, practicing it. The discipline of remaining present with people in their worst circumstances, returned to again and again over decades, produces a person who can remain present in their own worst circumstance. The third was the choice to speak truthfully in rooms where the truth was inconvenient. As a church leader with responsibilities that crossed into civil and governmental territory, Lawan Andimi sat in meetings with officials who had the ability to make things easier or harder for his communities. He was not a man who softened what needed to be said for the sake of the relationship. He named what was happening to his people. He asked for what was needed without apology. He said accurate things to people who had power over him, repeatedly and without flinching. This is a specific discipline, built through specific practice, the same way any other skill develops. By the time Boko Haram pointed a camera at him expecting fear, he had already spent years looking at hard realities and describing them clearly. The camera did not change the conditions he had been trained in. The fourth was the discipline of prayer as the central activity of his life rather than a supplementary one. People who knew him described the way he began each day, early, before the house was fully stirring, in long periods of scripture and silence. This is not uncommon among pastors as a stated ideal. It was uncommon, in Lawan Andimi's case, in the degree of seriousness and consistency with which he practiced it. It was the prayer of a man who believed that what happens in the interior is where everything visible is ultimately decided, and who therefore tended that interior landscape with the same disciplined attention a farmer gives to soil before planting season. What you carry into a crisis is whatever you have been putting in before the crisis arrived. He had been putting the same things in for 30 years. There should be no surprise about what came out when everything else was stripped away. The fifth was the decision to hold his own life loosely over such a long period that it had ceased to feel like a decision at all. He had said, in various ways and in various rooms over many years, that his life was not his own to protect at the cost of everything else he was responsible for. Among Christians, this is not a rare belief in the abstract. It is extremely rare as an actual operating principle. The kind of thing that determines what you do at 2 in the morning when the danger is real and the moment of decision cannot be deferred. He had operated on this principle long enough and often enough that it had become structural. When Boko Haram put him in a room and turned on a camera, they were not encountering a man who was scrambling to summon courage from somewhere he had never been before. They were encountering a man who had arrived at that room already knowing where he stood. Leave a comment below with "all things work together for good" if you are holding on to that promise right now in something that does not yet look like it is working. Because the man in that video was holding on to it too, and he had watched it become true in enough broken places, over enough broken years that he did not need to see the shape of his own ending to trust the one who held it. Here is what happened after Lawan Andimi was killed. The church did not break. In the weeks and months following his death, international attention turned briefly toward the Northeast. Statements from denominational leaders, coverage in Christian publications, appeals from advocacy organizations. Then the news cycle moved, the way it always moves. The churches stayed. The pastors who had served under his oversight continued meeting with their congregations. New leaders stepped into the visible roles. The Christian Association of Nigeria in Michika kept functioning. Gloria kept faith. His children grew. His name was cited in seminary classrooms and pastoral training sessions in Nigeria and beyond. Held up not as an abstract example of something called heroism, but as a concrete example of something called formation, of what a life looks like when it has been shaped over decades by the right disciplines toward the right end. The video became a text. It circulated not just as a news item, but as instruction, as evidence of something that people wanted to examine and grow toward. What would have to be true of my life for me to look like that in a room like that? It was asked by people in relative safety who watched a man in genuine danger speak with genuine peace and found they could not shake the question loose. That question has not gone away. It is still being asked. In that sense, Boko Haram filmed something they did not intend to film. They wanted to document defeat. They documented testimony. Lawan Andimi was 60 years old when he died. He had spent the better part of those 6 decades building churches, burying the dead, sitting with the broken, speaking truth to powerful people, and staying in a place where staying required something real. He had told his family and his colleagues, in various ways across many years, that he was prepared for whatever God allowed. He had meant it the way that men and women mean things when they have lived by a principle long enough that the statement and the life have become the same thing. He did not discover that principle on the day a camera was pointed at him. He walked into that room carrying something he had built over 30 years of ordinary, repeated, mostly unobserved faithfulness. The courage was not in the room. It had been in him the whole time. His name is not chiseled above the door of a famous cathedral. There is no national holiday in his honor. Not yet, perhaps not ever. But in the Michika hills, where he was born and served and is buried, in the churches, still meeting in buildings he helped to rebuild, in the young pastors who watched his life and decided to stay when leaving would have been easier, in the children raised by a man who showed them what it looks like to mean what you say for 30 years. In all of those places, what he built is still standing. Idi Amin could not stop Janani Luwum. Boko Haram could not stop Lawan Andimi. This is the thing that violence never fully grasps about people formed this way. When you kill them, you do not end their story. You write the last line of one chapter and turn the page to the next. And the story keeps going, in the people they shaped, in the communities they stayed for, in every witness who watched them and resolved to be the same kind of faithful in whatever small or large way their own life required. If you want to be part of a community committed to recovering and telling these hidden legacies well, stories of men and women whose courage was not accidental but built, consider joining us. You will find the link on the channel homepage. Next week, we follow a woman who walked into one of the most closed provinces in China in the early 20th century, was told repeatedly to leave, refused, and left behind a movement that survived everything the government threw at it for generations. Her name was not famous. What she did was, do not miss it.